Hello and welcome to episode 39 of the Wilder podcast. This week we explore the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, how it came to be and why Wales is now being watched by countries around the world looking to follow its lead. Hello Tom.
Hello. Another good episode, another great interview to look forward to. I feel like we could almost be spoiling the listeners, but it's actually more like we're spoiling ourselves a little bit by having these amazing chats with people.
And it's great because you start to make connections, don't you? And there's connections between this interview and last episode, and it's the richness and the dialogue and the thinking, and it's fantastic.
So before we talk about that in more detail with Jane Davidson, she's a fantastic lady and has done so much in so many ways, which by the time we finish the interview, you'll appreciate it. Should we do our normal introduction about ourselves, the project, and then go on to give a bit of quite an exciting update as well?
Yep, sounds good.
Okay, so for those that are new to the podcast, we are Chloe and Tom, husband and wife. We've been running something called the Grange project now for just over 2 years. Essentially, about 6 years ago, we realised, having done research into climate change and biodiversity loss, that unfortunately governments at the time were not doing and still aren't doing enough to even mitigate the damage, let alone actually start to compensate for it. So we wanted to look into ways in which we as a family could do something. And that's where the Grange project has come from. We have a small 80-acre farm that we are restoring back to nature in South Wales, in Monmouthshire. And we are also looking at ways in which we produce more human-edible food, educate more people, bring more kind of ecopreneurship to the site as well. So we're using this site in multiple ways, essentially as a test bed, I think, of what can be achieved.
And I think it's really apt to that introduction, Tom, that you mentioned, obviously us being in Wales and some of the government context, because I hadn't even heard of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act until we moved here. But actually now we're here and I understand it. It just makes it feel more right that this is where we set up location and this is where we're trying to do the work we're doing, because it feels like it so aligns with some of the principles of this amazing piece of legislation.
So Jane does go into it in some detail, but could you give the top level of what the Act actually involves?
So you want me to try and define the Act before the lady that wrote it essentially describes it in the episode?
It's called a teaser, Chloe. You can do it. Come on.
Okay, right. So at the heart of the Act is the kind of the clues in the name. It's about the well-being of future generations. So it's a piece of law, and actually this is its 10th year anniversary. So happy 10 years, Wellbeing Act. Essentially, it ensures that public bodies in Wales are having to take into account the impact of their decision-making on the long term, on future generations, and ensure it's a framework to enable these public bodies to make decisions holding this context in mind.
And again, for people that are new or have been following our story, they'll know that we've been working really hard. I say we writ large, i.e. the team of builders that are building the Grange Hub, which is our centre of education, outreach, corporate away days in the middle of our nature restoration project. We're coming closer and closer to our opening day, and we've had some good news.
Yeah, we could not be more delighted. We reached out to Derek Walker, who is the current Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, and Jane will go on the podcast to talk a bit about his role and the importance of that, has agreed to come on and open the centre as part of a community event to celebrate all that's been achieved in the land over the last 2 years and the fantastic resource that we have in the Grange Hub for both education and engagement,
in order to support the future generations of Wales, which is exactly, and beyond as well. So that's really exciting. We're really chuffed that he's agreed to come and he'll have a good tour around the land and really understand what we're trying to achieve. Right, shall we get into the chat?
Absolutely. And I think what's so wonderful about this conversation is Jane gives us a lovely sense of her context. She's been, I don't think we can underestimate the influence that she's had on so many elements of government policy over her tenure. And her passion and ability to communicate those ideas, the impact they've had, the trajectory she hopes for, and the energy she's still bringing into this work comes across in every element of this conversation.
Please excuse this slight interruption to the episode. We will go back to the interview in about 10 seconds. But if you're looking to escape the modern trappings and go to the centre of a nature restoration rewilding project in South Wales, then do think about our new cabins. They're sustainably built, beautifully placed, and quite literally the only thing that's going to disturb you are the birds in the morning. If you want to have a bit of a weekend escape, then feel free to go to our website, grangeproject.co.uk. In the top right corner, it says stay with us, and you can book for this season. Now back to the interview.
Hello, Jane, and welcome to the Wilder podcast.
Oh, I'm so pleased to be here. Thank you for asking me.
Oh, we're equally delighted that you've been able to carve out some time for us to talk about what I feel is a genuinely inspirational piece of legislation, which isn't a sentence you hear very often, but I think that absolutely applies to the Act. And it's been mentioned on the podcast a few times before. So, yeah, really delighted to have the opportunity to explore it in a bit more depth. But before we do so, I'm wondering if you could introduce yourself to the listeners and essentially how you found yourself one of the leading figures in the movement for sustainability in Wales.
Right. Okay. Well, that's a challenge. For a start, I'm Jane. I live on a small holding in West Wales where we have a small organic farm. We have 13 acres. We keep ducks, chickens, turkeys, sheep and pigs alternately. And we grow as much of our own food as possible. I actually am the dilettante here. When I say we, I really mean he.
Nice.
More food as possible because I seem to spend quite a lot of time speaking at events and traveling by very slow travel to other countries to take part in working with them on how they might do something similar to a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. But yes, I mean, essentially, I suppose I'm a mum, I'm a granny, and for some reason, I have been absolutely passionate about policy and law for young people, probably ever since I was 14. It's just that when you look backwards, it starts to make sense. And I realized at the age of 14, I was already trying to write policy for my school about taking us out on trips that would actually give us a kind of wider understanding of nature, etc. And my background, I suppose I had an unusual background in the sense that my father was a kind of international doctor, and therefore beyond my memory nearly. I was born in Birmingham. We went to New York. The only thing I remember about New York was the snow was much higher than I was. And I do kind of remember this day when we opened a door in the house and there was just snow.
Wow.
We couldn't get through it. So extraordinary snow, which we weren't used to. And you get those fleeting bits of memory, don't you, in your lives. We then went to Zimbabwe, where my father was there to start the first multiracial medical school in Africa. And that's where I lived until I was nearly 15. It has had a profound effect on my life, absolutely profound. I think it was actually this sort of notion of fairness for a start. It was about being brought up in a country that, although it didn't have the law of apartheid in the same way as South Africa, was profoundly unfair. And I witnessed that unfairness in my daily life. I remember when literally, one day I could go with my nanny into a park and the next day I couldn't. We had people next door who were offensively by the government called Cape Coloureds, who had to move because where we live was designated a white area. And even as a child, you kind of think, hang on, how can this be? How can colour of skin make a difference like this? But you're just absorbing it. And for me, I absorbed it in a way that made me feel this was incredibly unfair. But on the other hand, what I had was this amazing experience of nature. And of course, things like the WWF State of Nature report, it was the 1970, which it took as its start point. So we know how much nature we've lost. I mean, I think we're heading, if not over 70% of nature we've lost since 1970. And so I was there in 1970 experiencing the full panoply of nature in what was then called Rhodesia, in a Rhodesian countryside, out in the Flay, where we could see animals. Wild animals would come to the edge of the city of Harare. I used to go up in my bike. I had a particular affinity with snakes, but I had a heavy little piece of wood that I had on my bike carrier that if I was going through a dirt path, I used to bang the wood before I did so that any sleeping snakes in the sun might disappear before I went. You just lived in the wild with nature. And we were kicked out. I mean, people my age in Britain were also kicked out of their houses by their parents to just go and play outdoors and come in at dusk. And so we were. I cycled to school from the age of 5, which was quite some way away, but that's what we did. That was absolutely normal. And I think I remember the number plates for our cars being something like RSD 146 and 147, i.e. the total number of cars in the whole country. and therefore no safety issues on my journey. So I did have a really idyllic childhood. Parents whose motto was definitely about service, both doctors. My father worked establishing the medical school. My mother worked out in the bush, particularly with miners' wives. And it was a very long time later that she told me how awful the experiences of those women were. And my mother worked in an orphanage out in the bush. And that orphanage happens to be in a village where somebody who now runs Love Zimbabwe in Wales grew up. And it's kind of like, so there are these sort of amazing connections across the world. I do think there's something extraordinary about having grown up in such a different country to the UK. And I think it's very much that sort of, you can take the girl out of Africa, but you can't take Africa out of the girl. Mm-hmm. And many, many years later, when I took young people to work on water projects in Kenya from a youth club on the edge of Cardiff, when I arrived in Nairobi at the airport, and Nairobi is exactly the same altitude as Harare, which is important in this story. You know, I was kind of going, right, okay, now I want to go out first. The nuke leader here. This is me, I'm coming home. And they all laughed at me, but the plane door opened and I was there to lead all these young people out into Africa. And the smell overwhelmed me, and I felt on the plane steps. Because smell is the most extraordinary and potent and extreme attack on your senses when you smell something like the smell of home. I probably rambled a bit there, but yeah, I am a product of love of Africa, its nature, its people, and I kind of brought that into my life in the UK, and that fundamental caring about fairness, I think, and unfairness, and trying to tackle unfairness, then led me through a sort of career which does make sense looking back, going into teaching and youth work and curriculum development in the outdoors for the Youth Hostels Association, and into anti-poverty work and into politics at the local level, and setting up a housing help centre in a councillor role, and setting up a workplace nursery, and then moving into policy and law, and then politics at a Welsh level, a national level in Wales. And looking back, it's always been about how do we ensure that we look after current and future generations? And what does good governance look like? And what does good policy and law look like? And I still don't know, but I cannot celebrate over half my life now has been spent in this wonderful country of Wales. And I feel embraced by Wales and its people. And I've learned Welsh, not entirely fluently, but I can get by. And I love this place, and I love the community aspects here, and I love the way people embrace local, and I love the fact that this is the first country in the world that had the imagination and the ambition to pass the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in 2015.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I just loved the fact that it started off with that sense of place and your organic farm, and I can really picture you in that context. And then it moved on to those family identities, and then the kind of history of your cultural experiences. And, you know, the temptation's often to start with those professional contexts, but it was really lovely to hear about that kind of evolution and what's informed those professional identities. There are so many things I want to pick up on, but I'm going to try and keep really focused in this conversation. And I'm aware we mentioned the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act a few times, but for listeners who have no idea what we're talking about, I wonder if you could just introduce people to what the Act is.
Yes, I mean, like anything, the Act in Wales is built on the shoulders of giants. And I think the sort of main giant in this piece was when the UN agreed a definition of sustainable development, which is development that meets the needs of the present, but doesn't compromise on the ability of future generations to meet its own needs. And that was adopted across the whole world in the first Earth Summit in 1992. And that really was the sort of single phrase that has dominated virtually everything I've done since I first discovered it. Because it just seemed to me that this is the ultimate fairness, intergenerational equity. is about doing what you can to ensure that your children, their children, and children yet to come also have a fair future. And when we know that actually the very extractive policies that are delivered by all governments in some form or other across the world, then you sort of think this is actually going to create a place that's unlivable for future generations. So that actually became for me a mantra. It's quite hard to sort of sell in terms of a pub conversation. Apart from the fact that people all care about their kids and they want their kids to have good lives. And of course, they'd want their kids' kids to have good lives. So for me, this became about how to win an argument that says, what are the things that we most need to do in order to ensure that our children, their children, and children yet to come can have good lives, because we, as the decision makers now, have thought about that. And that really underpins the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So fast forward, you had the 1992 First Earth Summit. And then in Wales, in 1999, we had the first National Assembly for Wales, the first devolved government. And that devolved government at the time had absolutely no powers. But in the Government of Wales Act that set us up, there was a duty to promote sustainable development in everything we do. And then there were process instructions about how we had to produce a report. And then any incoming administration would then look at what the previous government had done and make an assessment, etc. And I was really excited by this. I think most people who were elected to the National Assembly in 1999, and that included me, by the way, didn't even know this duty existed. And it really excited me, and it really excited many members of the cabinet. And I was privileged to be education minister at the time in that first, second and third administrations. And the reason it excited us was that this duty didn't apply anywhere else. It was a duty that wasn't in Scottish legislation or the Northern Ireland legislation when they were established. It only applied to Wales. And we felt a kind of moral duty to really deliver on this. And that meant that we really started looking at what being sustainable looked like across the piece. But over that first decade, from 1999 to 2009, we discovered a couple of very important issues. And one was that the duty to promote does not mean anything. The civil service took a while to disgorge that very important fact to us, nearly a decade, in fact, but they'd already checked it out, unsurprisingly. And I promote this every day of my life. But of course, that doesn't mean anything because people can walk away. They don't have any duty to deliver. They only have a duty to promote. So, of course, in all our speeches, we made great claims to our commitments, but didn't necessarily had a mechanism in terms of actually changing the frame. But to be fair, also, until 2011, the Welsh Government had no primary lawmaking powers either. So what I was delighted about is that in 2011, when I discovered that there was no effect of the duty to promote, I became determined to turn this into a duty to deliver. And particularly because we'd just had a UK election in 2010. There'd been a coalition government that came in, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. And I think it was by accident rather than design, the Sustainable Development Commission, this fantastic group of independent advisors that had advised the UK government and all the devolved administrations for a decade at that point, summarily disappeared overnight. And that was the single point at which I realised that if we don't have a duty to deliver, and if we don't have a mechanism in Wales that requires the Welsh Government and public services to deliver, then actually this duty to promote will have been rendered meaningless. And that's the point at which I proposed what is now the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And so in summary, for people coming new to this, the Act is basically 7 goals directly linked to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which should be delivered by 2030 and have been signed up to by UN members across the world, over 190 of them. Those goals look to create a Wales which is prosperous, resilient, healthier, more equal, cohesive, vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language and globally responsible. So that's the what that has to be delivered. But there's also, very importantly, there's a requirement on how you deliver this. So you deliver this through 5 incredibly important ways of working. The Welsh Government and all its public services have to think long term. They have to think preventatively. They have to collaborate. They have to integrate outcomes, and they have to involve people about whom decisions are being made. The Act applies to all the Welsh public services, including the Welsh Government. And to hold those to account, there is an independent Future Generations Commissioner. The Auditor General's role has changed. So the Auditor General now has to incorporate the Future Generations Act in his or her advice to government and public services. And because it's a piece of legislation, it can be referred to the courts through judicial review. So basically, Wales now has an act linked to Sustainable Development Goals, where there are required processes to be delivered by all the public services, including government, and where there is 3 major accountability routes that the people of Wales can use in terms of trying to make sure that their public services and government deliver on what effectively is a new constitution for Wales.
It's so fascinating for me to hear the history of development, which you articulated so beautifully. So thank you for that. I was interested there, and when you were talking about the kind of what of delivery, the long term, the preventative, the collaborative, those aren't normally words I would associate with how governments operate, long term thinking and preventatively. I wonder whether there was a kind of universal appetite for the Act at the time of its creation, or whether there was resistance from particular places in the development.
I think it'd be fair to say there was both. I think that many people didn't understand what the Act was releasing. And I think that is really important, because remember that Wales is not a member state in its own right. And yet it is the only country in the world that has a legal mechanism to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals, which is quite extraordinary considering we're only 5 years away from the commitment to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals that countries signed up to in 2014. And I think that people really like the idea of having a country which is focused on current and future generations, but they don't know how to do it. So one of the very, very important parts of this is that the law is not punitive. The law is about releasing the imagination, because we don't know how to do this. If you're the first country in the world to do something, you have no model. You sort of jump into this massive void. There's individual examples of good practice, like people who've demonstrated, including you, about how to do nature restoration, etc. But actually, as a philosophical moral compass, a constitution to guide everything that is done, there is no other model. So it's not surprising that here in the 10th anniversary of the Act, that we still are finding ourselves in very early territory, and not least because this is so countercultural, because this is not the way governments normally do business. And yet, if you talk to people who are making policy and law in government, they'd really love to do business this way. Because mostly what happens, particularly in a crisis, is that you end up with short-term decision-making based on something that is broken in a chain of events. And of course, your short-term decision may break something else in the system. So in system terms, what happens is that each of those breaks and the short-term reaction drives the system further away from its initial intention. And also, if you think about the time and effort that governments put into performance indicators to what those indicators should represent, the time spent on that could far better look at how you take decisions that are going to have better impacts. Because your indicators will not show outcomes potentially for many years, but they need to be measuring the right things. So previously, when all governments in the UK were subject to sustainable development indicators. I remember coming in as minister into the environment brief in 2007 going, well, lots of these don't apply to Wales because those insects don't come here or those birds don't come here. Actually, they may do now with changing climate. So this fitness for purpose issue is really important, and having processes that people can get behind. Now, interestingly, my next piece of work will be looking at just what those 5 ways of working really mean in terms of governance, because there's no definition to them. And of course, long term in politics can be longer than a week, or at the height of COVID, longer than an hour. Whereas we might really want to be thinking about long term in the context of 200 years or 7 generations, if we're really going to look after the interests of our children and their children and children yet to come. And I often, in a very anecdotal way, when I'm talking to people about this, I use a sort of metaphor, which is about the fact that my mum is 95 and therefore she's in her 10th decade. My youngest grandchild is 4. She's in her 1st decade. But here are 2 people who I love to bits. And between them, they'll span 200 years of life. And so we think, how can we make sure that my youngest grandchild's life is going to be as full as my mum's, who celebrates so often that she, growing up just after the war, the Second World War, she's grown up in a century without war. I don't think we can offer that to my youngest grandchild at the moment. These are within our time frame and understanding. These aren't beyond it.
That's a wonderful way of looking at it. 200-year time frame, I think, really drives it home. I'm wondering, for someone like myself, I'd quite like practical examples and dumb it down for someone like poor old me. But can you kind of articulate some examples? The Act's been around for a decade now. So from your experience, what's gone well, and a few examples of the Act being used well to drive the changes that you've hoped would happen. And maybe, if you wouldn't mind, reflecting on some areas where lessons learned from the whole process. Like you say, this is the first time it's been done, and it's what an achievement.
I think I do have to start, Tom, by saying this is about a whole system change. So often when we think of, good examples of things, that it's almost as though they're the end goal. But actually, we would hope that every organisation is moving towards more good examples, because there is enough rigour in the Act. So the Commissioner can be a critical friend to all the public sector organisations and to Welsh Government. The Commissioner can help the public sector look at where perhaps it should be identifying greater investment of effort. And we had the first Commissioner, Sophie Howe, was with us for 7 years. The second Commissioner, Derek Walker, is also been appointed for 7 years. And he's very clearly looking at ideas about the inadequacy of government policy around food, for example, not joining food up across all the areas, for example, in the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, because food contributes to our global responsibility, our prosperity, our resilience, our health, our equality, cohesive communities, a vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language. And many of our farmers are Welsh speaking and been on land for 12 generations, and also our global responsibility. So it's about how you change what you're looking at, and also issues around adaptation in the context of climate. Our most recent piece of work, Wales Net Zero 2035, which focuses on delivering pathways, 10-year pathways that will both deliver net zero in an accelerated way, but actually also do it in a way that has lots of public benefits in the context of buildings and heating, public benefits in the context of transport systems and better digital connections to avoid people having to use private transport, feeding itself, or what can education, jobs and work look like? How can Wales meet its energy needs? How can Wales become more resilient? And that work is badged under the idea that there are pathways to a prosperous and resilient Wales in a changing future. And it could not have happened without the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, because this work, which is predicated on academic work for the Wales Centre for Public Policy, who wrote us underpinning reports on all of these areas before we started testing their ideas and our ideas and developing examples of good practice. This work and the acceleration of it could only have happened in a country committed to delivering well-being for the Welsh people as quickly as possible. But it's also about being imaginative and challenging models inside government. I mean, I'm absolutely in awe of the Welsh Government for doing its universal basic income pilot for care leavers from 2022 to 2023. Universal basic income is a model that is advocated in many countries, but actually piloted in very few. And the point of this model was to take literally the most disadvantaged group of young people, those people leaving the care system when they become adult, and look at whether or not interventions that help them have access to better training, education, or work, that actually give them health support, that actually give them a home, all of those things, can you actually change the outcomes for them? And that work is nearing completion, and we'll know what the academic interpretation of that is relatively shortly, but a really exciting and different way of doing things. The Welsh Roads Review in 2023, where road building projects were stopped after failing a climate review. The ban on smacking children in 2021. I was one of the advocates for that back in 2003, and we couldn't get anywhere with it. And following the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, of course, that sort of approach is absolutely the way people wanted to go. And if we think about the 20-mile-per-hour speed limit, I mean, it's aroused a lot of ire and a lot of support. But that 20-mile-an-hour speed limit to reduce emissions and improve air quality has led to fewer deaths on the road, has led to communities being safer, and has led to a reduction in emissions. So you see some pretty brave outcomes at country level because of the Act being in place. And I think it's important to demonstrate those. You know, the length and breadth of Wales, you've got Carmarthenshire County Council developing really important climate group work between schools and teachers and local communities. You've got a lot of new initiatives linked to previous work I did on recycling with heading for zero waste by 2050, where Wales is now Wales is already in the top 3 of recycling countries in the world, and is determined to get to number 1 because the legislation I introduced squeezes what has to be recycled every year. And that sort of squeezing legislation, exactly what the Climate Change Act does in the context of the UK. We were the first to pilot with my regulations on carrier bag charges. And that was all in the spirit of this sort of approach. And yet within 4 years, every other part of the UK followed. So I think there's something about the size of Wales, which is why my book is called Lessons from a Small Country. We're big enough to pilot really, really important actions, and small enough to get all the key partners in a room to have those discussions.
It's really powerful to hear all those examples described as you just did. And I love that notion of brave outcomes. And I think courage is a really important part of this journey. I think I remember reading, it's Lee, isn't it, the Minister for Transport, who was pushing forward the 20-mile-per-hour limit.
Lee Waters, Deputy Minister for Transport.
Thank you so much. And I remember reading an article in which he wrote that this is the start of a number of courageous decisions we're going to have to make as a nation. And that really spoke to me. And I suppose I'm interested in how you think the Act gives ministers, gives organisations, gives individuals the confidence to make some of these brave decisions and the permission to do so.
Yes, I often describe the Act as the permission to think differently. And I think what's quite extraordinary is pretty well every time you sort of poll young people on things that matter, what matters to them is to have a livable planet. And what matters to a lot of them is to work in jobs where they feel that they are contributing towards a good in relation to people and planet. And what matters to them as well is the degrees they go and do or the courses they go and do will help them do that in their working lives. And I feel really excited about that. And that bravery is just being displayed every day inside the public organisations in Wales, not least because of something which is called the Future Generations Commissioners Academy. And that's where every year a set of young people who are working in those public service organisations gather together to really look at releasing their imagination and doing projects back in the organisations that deliver on the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And this isn't about more examples of good practice. This is about system change. And of course, all these young people will grow up into the roles of the senior executives, and they are really ambitious. So you're absolutely right. What the Act does is give people legislative confidence because of the competence that has to be delivered through the Act. And we all feel more confident if we know the law is on our side. And if it's a law that you really want to work effectively, it becomes more important that you demonstrate the outcomes from it.
I think that brings me quite nicely on to my reflection from that. Is one half of the battle is the confidence from a legal perspective. And the other half, I think, which is equally as important, is the electorate. It's communicating not only what the Act is there to do, but also it's the changes that need to be made. It's why they need to be made, the positive impacts on the electorate that they hopefully will have, whether it's this generation, the next generation, or future generations. And then maybe the perceived short-term pain point and why that needs to be taken. And I've seen that with the 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. It was very divisive. And I'm keen to hear your thoughts on the power of communication and how we're doing it well, or maybe could do it better.
Yeah, it's such an important question, Tom. I mean, I think we're moving into a very new era in terms of information, misinformation, disinformation, and culture wars. And it's even more important, I think, to underpin what governments propose with really solid evidence. I mean, it's certainly true to say that many, many thousands of climate scientists across the world agree on evidence. They're building that evidence base all the time. So provided you are able to speak to an audience which is listening in the context of academic underpinning, you can normally give a counter narrative to the approach that taking action on climate is actually going to destroy our lives. Whereas our absolute fundamental proposition from 2 years' work on net zero from thousands of people who input to it is that actually a planned transition is the only way you can have a just transition. And reacting to short-term shocks is the most expensive and potentially worst way of dealing with any issue. And we can look at that in all our daily lives as well. I think those of us who really want to ensure that we get a fair hearing have to hugely rely on having really solid academic underpinning. And the reason I like academic underpinning is it has to be peer reviewed. It has to stand up to the test of other academics. So I'm very much in a camp which says that all governments should use academic underpinning of their policy, regulatory, and ultimately fundamental law direction. And that takes time. And therefore, we do have to ensure that universities are adequately funded in order for academics to play their crucially important role in protecting evidence. But in all the things I've done, you will see from the curriculum, which we now have in Wales post 2022, that came out of academic work I commissioned as Education Minister back in the early 2000s. And it's that academic work that enabled that curriculum to continue its development rather than being taken off route by those people who wanted to prevent change. So we do have a duty, a really important duty, in standing up for facts, standing up for evidence. And I don't think we are really in a post-truth world. I think we just have to find new communication media to make sure that people understand the basis of good decisions.
Yeah, well, I've just having lots of reflections from you. Firstly, I just reflected that I'm feeling very lucky that we are in a country and our kids are being brought up in a country that you've been involved in, Jane. Because we look at the curriculum here and seeing what they get to do and knowing the impact that's having on them in the even just the natural world and the engagement they have with it, I think is wonderful. And secondly, I'm really glad you said that we need to explore different forms of communication, because I think you've got the importance of the academic underpinning, and that is crucial. You absolutely need that foundation just to be able to stand up and look people in the eye and say this is the right way forward. But I would also say that we've got to think about creative ways in which we engage. We take that information and we engage with people where they are, not where we want them to be. So how do we use social media, different social media platforms, and communicate it in a way that they want to listen, which is a way I think it's quite hard for government to do that. How do you have the academic rigor and approach mindset and then also have that creative social media mindset that require two different skill sets, but we've got to try and nail both of them.
I have to say that other than doing my best by 3 or 4 events every week of my life somewhere in the world talking about this stuff, that is my method of communication. It's not going to sell thousands of books from my publisher, but I'm pretty confident that my book will be in a policy office in every government that's interested in this. And I think that that's where my bit is. And then other people have to do other bits. It's also about what is perceived as good and bad. I mean, my favorite headline ever, Tom, and it was when I was developing the foundation phase curriculum. For those listening, that's our curriculum in Wales for 3 to 7-year-olds. And having been brought up in Africa, as you've already heard, I wanted that to be very strongly based on play and learning about the outdoors, and where appropriate, having as many lessons as possible outdoors. And the incredible thing that did is that when I first became education minister, the biggest request I had was from the schools to say they wanted to tarmac over gardens because they couldn't afford people to cut the lawn, etc. And there were far too many staff members coming who needed to park cars. And we introduced this idea that they had to actually have education outdoors. And then schools abandoned this idea they had to have more tarmac and they wanted more land. And the best headline I ever had was "Minister makes children play in the rain." And of course, they came to me to go, well, what are you going to say about this? And I went, yes, absolutely. So it's about reframing what matters. And I think in terms of communication, if we can throw some of those things back that they expected me to apologize and say, no, we pull them all indoors. We only do it outside. We said, no, but we actually provided funding in the pilots so that we could actually make sure that children without the appropriate rain gear could also go outside in the rain. But I think quite a telling notion that the press will come to you thinking X. And actually, particularly if you can do it with humour and turn it round and say why, then you can have a different outcome. And if we just go back to the 20 mile an hour, that was a culture war motivation, the antagonism to that, very, very clearly in my view. Mm-hmm. And what we have seen, and you don't just see it in Wales, you see it right across Europe, you see it the length and breadth of towns and villages in England and Scotland and Northern Ireland as well. Communities like 20 miles an hour in areas where children live. 20 is plenty where people live. And in fact, what Wales did by suggesting that it would do it, and of course it wasn't a national speed limit, it was a speed limit for where people lived. And the argument has been about, well, there's the roads connecting where people live. What should be the right speed limits there? And of course, that's now back with a partnership between the Welsh Government and the county councils to deem what is appropriate. And all of that will contribute towards a safer Wales. And when we got the figures to say that actually so many lives had been saved, health benefits in air pollution, and also benefits locally in terms of children feeling safer, that actually demonstrates that when you do this, it's not anti-motorist, it's pro-family. And I think the biggest thing that I'd want to say to anybody here is this is all pro-family, past, present, and future.
You mentioned right at the start, Jane, that Wales has been the first nation to put something like this into legislation. And I'm really curious about what the international response has been. Have we got other nations looking over at what's happening here and thinking, yeah, I might like some of that? And what has been the feedback?
Well, yes, and it would be hard to describe the number of people who are engaged in other nations, both in Welsh Government through the Future Generations Commissioner's Office, academics in universities, and me sitting in my little attic in West Wales. I probably do 3 to 4 events every week of my life in other countries, and have ever since the book was published in 2020. There are a number of countries engaged in the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and WeGov, the Wellbeing Economy Governments. But I think probably the most extraordinary thing that's happened recently is back in September of 2024, the UN General Assembly, those 190 odd members across the world, agreed a proposal that they should consider an envoy for future generations for the UN, and then look at that potentially happening in every country by 2028, which is predicated on the Welsh model of the Future Generations Commissioner. So a lot of work is going in at the moment into what that looks like. The very exciting thing for me is that just before that General Assembly, there was a Future Generations event held in Wales with civil society across the world, which was then followed up by another one in Nairobi and then another one in New York just prior to the General Assembly. The enthusiasm from young people across the world for this is absolutely extraordinary. So I'm still working with a lot of those young people on, well, what could this look like? And what should this look like in a way that always reflects the culture, the economy, the society, and the environment of individual countries. And therefore, for me, it's always about saying what we did here was right for us. It may not be right for you, but hopefully some of the lessons that we've learned will help you do this a lot quicker. And I know that there are many countries across the world which are actively looking at what has happened in Wales. And a really exciting one is the fact that it's the Wales-Japan year this year, and the centrepiece of the partnership between Wales and Japan is the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And I was privileged to be part of a major film for Welsh Government about interviewing young people from Japan about their hopes in Wales and in Japan about future generations. So all sorts of things are happening.
I mean, echoing what Tom said, Jane, thank you so much for all the work you have done, that you're continuing to do, your passion and your determination. It comes across so clearly to us in this conversation. I'm sure it will do to the listeners as well. We'll make sure that in the show notes, we've got all the details of where you can find Jane's book if you want to read that, and equally where you can find out more details about the Act. So thank you again for your time. We really appreciate it. And again, thank you for all the work you're doing.
Well, what an absolute pleasure. And thank you for the work that you're doing. I'm really interested in how that's going to develop over the years. So, diolch yn fawr iawn.
What an impressive individual. I think that we shouldn't also underestimate the amount of resilience that she's needed to drive all that change. And now, I'm not saying she's done it all by herself, and I'm sure there's a wider team supporting her and she's just part of this bigger movement, but driving change, as we've learned and as we know, requires so much energy in every sense of the word. And if you're trying to change things the way they've always been, you're always going to hit rose bumps, and you're always going to hit detractors, and you're always going to hit people that don't want to change. So the fact she's achieved so much during her tenure in this country, or time in this country, I just think is phenomenal. And I just think, what an impressive individual.
I think there was a comparison there with Tony Juniper, who we had on in our last episode, of someone that really understands the principles of systems change and understands that. I think it was the response to the question you asked, Tom, about how has this been put into practice. And I think you always know you're talking to a system thinker when they caveat their response by saying, essentially what we're trying to do here is kind of change the approach or the philosophy or the why of doing things, and how that might translate into a kind of what is kind of, there's some uncertainty about that, and we need to let the system take responsibility for some of those changes, that can't all come from a central piece of legislation. It's about setting the context, which then needs to be adopted within local context to best reflect their interpretation of those principles.
I mean, that's one interpretation of that, and I appreciate that. And you are probably right. I was just thinking that I was impressively talking to a politician at that stage. But she's not wrong, is she? Ultimately, it's changes by inches as opposed to by anything else.
And I would love to say, with safe certainty, this is the change that is going to be achieved and this is what's going to make the difference to our system. But I don't think anyone has that answer. So actually how we tolerate that kind of safe uncertainty of not really knowing but having confidence in the individuals that are driving forward the legislation and the principles that it inspires is step one of the journey.
Mm-hmm. What's one of your kind of top takeaways?
I think this sounds like a really basic takeaway, but for me, this concept of intergenerational equity, like I've thought about equity a lot in terms of issues of diversity and inclusion and in our current way of being, and even in relation to a kind of a historical context, but actually thinking about what that means for not just our children, but our children's 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 children. And also acknowledging that it takes quite a lot of mental flexibility to consider the impacts of our current decisions, not just on the children we see in front of us, but on those many generations to come. And how you help to kind of hold on to that picture isn't an easy answer.
No, I wish it was. I mean, as you were speaking then, I was just thinking about all the graphs that I've seen of the kind of CO2 in the atmosphere and actually how, since the Industrial Revolution, which wasn't that many generations ago, and that the huge detrimental impact we've had in very few generations, it shows the importance of being aware that actually we are creating change and it is in our lifetime, but it's not going to affect us as much as our children, which is fairly anxiety provoking. But what we can do is do what we can do and keep moving forward and speaking to amazing people like Jane and hoping there's whole hordes of people like her that are coming up in the next generation to drive as much change as she's doing.
And as someone that perhaps sits within a bit of an academic frame, I really appreciated her.
You mean you're a course leader at a university in the UK?
Well, yes.
You're a lecturer?
Yes.
In fact, you're a doctor as well?
Yeah. Well,
okay, good.
Yeah. I like research. Okay. I like research not because for the sake of research, but because I like the impact it can have. I like how it can have influence and it gives weight to stories. That's why I like research. And I think the point Jane was making about the importance of evaluation and having that as a kind of foundational principle to both understanding the impact of pieces of legislation like the Wellbeing Act and also to drive forward some of that decision making was really well made.
It was well made, but as I was hearing it, I was just thinking that is true. And I can imagine it's very hard in government to drive change that isn't backed by numbers, that isn't quantifiable. However, there's a whole world out there that isn't backed by numbers and quantifiable that's driving some change that doesn't require academics to prove anything. And I think you almost need two things. You need the academic rigor, but also a bit of entrepreneurial flair, a bit of outside the box thinking that maybe is new thinking and therefore doesn't have the data behind it. But we can't wait 15 years, 10 years, whatever, to have the data to back up some decisions. I think there's time for academic rigor, there's time for backing up driving change, but there's also time for applying common sense and best practice and also not being scared of failure as well.
Well, you've nudged me into another systemic theoretical reference. Which is,
excellent. Tell me more as I sip on my drink.
It's the concept of both and, isn't it? And there's something about rigor and imagination, which is a phrase we think about within systemic philosophy.
So I'm a philosopher, am I?
You were trying to be. I also think the critiques you're making of academic understandings are also really valid. Like academia, it takes a really long time because it has to go through various degrees of review, which sometimes are often, in fact, unnecessarily long. And it also speaks to a particular person who's telling that story within a particular context, often with a particular agenda. And perhaps we have an illusion of academic research being this kind of unbiased, neutral perspective. And that's just not the case because it's conducted by humans and therefore they're going to tell a story that fits in with the story that feels comfortable for them. So I think we have to acknowledge that within the academic world, we are still talking about storytelling and not certainty.
So we're all flawed as humans, basically.
Flawed, like, we just have to appreciate that context is critical, and there are very many ways of influencing change and telling stories, and data is one of those ways, stories is another way, qualitative research, which is essentially stories dressed up and well analysed, are also part of it, and memes are, and photos are as well. It's all understanding that there's many things that are required to influence our communications and influence behavioural change effectively.
And the problem is, what you just described is quite a complicated concept and requires a lot of self-reflexivity and the ability to take all of these points on board in order to then mash them all together and come up with a good way forward. And what proportion of the population would you say has skill sets that could do that?
As humans, we like to reduce stuff down, don't we, to what feels simple and manageable and containable.
And fits in your personal brain's way of functioning.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And everyone's brain functions in completely different ways. And there's a whole spectrum of ways that brains function.
Absolutely. And there are some people that naturally think systemically and can tolerate lots of uncertainty and difference. And there are some people that think in quite a linear way. And that's just kind of how they are. And it's not, maybe even not recognizing that one is better than the other. We need both, like any good systemic person would say. But yeah, how we nurture that way of thinking, particularly in a world of communications through social media where things become more and more polarized, and the algorithms are deliberately positioning us into certain camps where we're looking for certainty to feel safe in a time of global anxiety, is a tricky question that I'm not professing to have the answer to. But I do feel like nature and understanding natural systems is a springboard into systemic thinking and connections, which is part of what we're trying to achieve with the Grange charity.
Ooh, I like this tangent we're going down, but let's try and pull it back slightly. I think we've probably got one more reflection before we close out. What's your second best?
This wasn't something that was explicitly talked about in the conversation, but I was struck by how obviously the focus of the Act is on public bodies, and that makes sense as a piece of government legislation that's set up in that way. But a lot of the change and a lot of the power in our nation sits within the private sector and private individuals. And how do we help them go on a similar journey to hold some of these principles of working and some of the wellbeing goals outlined in the Act in mind, in the way that fits within their context?
I mean, that's a really tough question to answer, which I don't think we've got time for today. But I mean, my initial reflections are there are some organisations trying to do it, and you've got B Corp organisations, and you've got other ones that are creating their own frameworks in order to bear that in mind. But to drive real change on a national or international level with these businesses, I may be wrong here, and I'd love to get a guest on to talk about it. Maybe we should go and look for somebody. But I still think it comes back to governments making that bold decision to produce directives that influence the businesses, to tell them how, if you want to operate in this country, these are the rules of which you've got to operate by. Because of the capitalist system we're in, I just don't see the majority of organisations who are essentially legally bound to focus on profits for shareholders above all else. Like, how can they pivot and change significantly unless your shareholders behind them?
And ultimately, government legislation then creates a level playing field, doesn't it? Otherwise, you have to be the first mover, and then you kind of get the disadvantage of that, perhaps in terms of the effects on profits, which will then make your shareholders grumpy. And then that connects back to the point you just made around what the responsibility are of these organisations. And maybe we need to go back to the episode on tribalism to talk about some of the ideas that Tony shares about how we're going to support that change in terms of the level of taxation and other initiatives that he proposed within that new political philosophy.
Yeah, and if you haven't listened to that episode, a link to that will be in the show notes. I think we've come to the end of this chat. I think we could keep going, but I just feel like we should try and keep it, short episode is a good episode.
And perhaps it's testament to the quality of the conversation. This has probably been one of our longest post-episode reflections, and it's generated lots of thinking for us, which is a sign of a good conversation.
If you agree, dear listener, then there is one thing you could do, or two things, I suppose. I mean, share the episode wherever you think it might be relevant and could benefit from it, because I think there's lots of places it could do. And secondly, if you do have 5 minutes, just stop what you're doing, get yourself onto your podcasting app and leave us a review either on Spotify, Apple, wherever you listen to this. It makes a huge difference, and it just allows us to naturally grow and help. It has benefited you, and hopefully it will benefit other people.
And if you fancy coming and continuing the chat over a cup of tea in person, our next Community Day is on the 10th of May, and we would love to welcome you.
Yeah, the links will be in the show notes, and we'll talk about that in more detail on the top of the next podcast. Bye.